including a local journalist and a senior rescue service official, according to local health authorities. Separate strikes were reported in Khan Younis in the south, Jabalia in the north and Nusrat in central Gaza. Gaza's civil defence had reported earlier that an Israeli airstrike had killed 9 children belonging to a married pair of doctors in the southern city of Khan Younis, to which the Israeli military now has stated that the strikes are under review. According to an exclusive report by Associated Press, several Palestinians and soldiers said that Israeli troops are systematically forcing Palestinians to act as human shields. The Israeli troops have been sending them into buildings and tunnels to check for explosives or Hamas members. They further said that this practice has become synonymous during Israel's offensive. On the diplomatic front, foreign ministers from European and West Asian countries are meeting in Madrid today for talks aimed at increasing pressure on Israel to halt its offensive in Gaza. The meeting, hosted by Spain, is part of growing international calls to end the war and lift the blockade on humanitarian aid. Egypt's foreign minister is among those expected to attend, with the recognition of a Palestinian state also on the agenda. Malaysia's foreign minister, Mohammed Hassan, has condemned what he called atrocities in Gaza, accusing the international community of indifference and double standards. He made the remarks ahead of an ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur and said the bloc cannot remain silent. Meanwhile, French and Palestinian rights groups have filed a legal bid to block 8 Israeli weapons companies from participating in the Paris Air Show. The move is part of a legal pressure campaign in response to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. On the other hand, the conflict over hostages still persists, with more than 50 hostages, dead and alive, still claimed to be held by Hamas. Well, with several developments in the last 24 hours, joining us to discuss those is Jordan Cope, a Middle East expert who is joining us from Effort in Germany. Jordan, thank you ever so much for joining us. I first want to ask you about the global condemnation which has been coming in and more talks now over the situation in Gaza, multi-nation talks looking at the current situation. Why do you think there's been a recent shift from some world leaders and nations in their stance towards Israel?
I think to begin, it's important to note that whatever action Israel takes, it will unfortunately be due to international scrutiny simply because of anti-Israel bias. If you look at the United Nations and the General Assembly, where over 50% of all condemnations have been used to target Israel, blaming the Jewish state has long served convenient for not only anti-Semites, but for autocracies who wish to scapegoat Israel in order to avoid accountability for their own abuses. We're currently seeing some more Western nations being more outspoken with their criticism towards Israel, not per se because of how Israel has conducted the war, but simply because we're seeing new political regimes in countries such as the United Kingdom, which has changed politically over the last few years or whatnot. We're seeing different political parties coming into power and often aligning with one another, whether that be the new administration with Keir Starmer or with the new administration with Carney in Canada, or relatively new at least. And also Macron has also happened to have been somebody who wants to assert more influence in the region, especially given France's previous role in Lebanon, but also France wanting to project more power and influence than it deserves. I will say about this war that Israel has conducted one of the most just wars in one of the most densely populated areas in the Middle East. If you ask military experts such as John Spencer, Israel has effectively fought a war with some of the lowest civilian to combatant casualty rates in modern day urban warfare. The tragedy of war is that it ultimately and often claims civilian lives. And each civilian life that is lost is to be mourned. But it's also important to note that when Israel is having to fight a genocidal terrorist group that killed 1,200 people on October 7th and is fighting from a very densely populated area, from hospitals, from tunnels, it's very difficult ultimately to be able to uproot the problem. And I will say in modern day warfare, The United Nations itself even notes that 90% of all casualties in modern day urban warfare are civilian casualties. So, what Israel has ultimately done is send millions of evacuation notices, such as in this recent calamity that happened. Sent millions of evacuation notices. It's provided evacuation corridors, which is not common so much in modern day urban warfare. And on top of that, the world loves to spin mistruths about Israel. They've done this previously when it comes to medical misinformation. They claimed that Israel once targeted the al-Ahli hospital and killed 500 people. It was later found that that incident was an errant rocket fired from the Islamic Jihad that killed 50 people. And so, unfortunately, tragedies do happen in war. But the reality is that Israel does investigate. Israel did send evacuation notices over a month ago in the area where, unfortunately, the al-Najjar family lost 8 or 9 of its family victims. But we need to give time to see, because time again, misinformation has resulted in lies against Israel, such as the United Nations Representative Tom Fletcher, who recently claimed that Israel was going to kill 14,000 babies in the next 2 days as a result of famine, which never happened.
Absolutely, Jordan. Thank you for providing some context there. Of course, there are disputes on both sides. There was the shooting against the military convoy, which Israel put their hands up and said we made a mistake with this one. So there have been instances of that both ways. But one thing I do want to look at, you mentioned there about tunnels, and we know that Hamas has used hospitals and other areas within civilian infrastructure to hide. There are reports that have been coming out about Palestinians being used as human shields, being sent into these tunnels, being sent into these buildings that could be used by Hamas. So I want your response to that, please, Jordan.
Well, it will take an investigation to ultimately see, and I would say what's going on the ground, but in this case, it's certainly under the ground. But one thing for sure is that Hamas is the ultimate perpetrator when it comes to use of human shields. It's been found to have locked people inside of buildings despite evacuation notices being sent from the IDF about imminent targets to take place on those said buildings. Hamas ultimately fires rockets into Israel. It has tunnels itself and refuses to allow civilians to use those tunnels. It is Hamas at the end of the day, for every one of its single rockets that it sent into Israel, has committed a double war crime. It's important to understand that this is ultimately what Hamas wants at the end of the day. It wants to fight impossible wars in terms of wars that, one, it can't win, but wars that it can use to delegitimize Israel when Israel ultimately decides to respond. Because it's unbelievable. I don't think a lot of the outside world truly understands this. But when a rocket is sent into Israel, the psychological terror that persists is magnificent in terms of how tragic it is. People having to run to bomb shelters. It shuts down the entire economy at a moment's notice. And on top of that, when Israel's defense interceptors shoot up into the sky and take down these rockets, oftentimes you can actually hear the explosion. This is a war that's ultimately very tragic, but Hamas has continued to refuse to release the hostages unconditionally, and Israel has every right to respond to make sure that those hostages are released. Any other precedent ultimately creates a future in which terrorism is the norm and response is the exception, and that simply cannot be allowed, whether it be in Kashmir or whether it be in Israel.
Jordan, let's now look at hostages. I'm glad you mentioned the situation that, of course, is ongoing. The devastating impact it's causing across Israel is leading to some discontent amongst Israelis with the way in which the Netanyahu government is carrying out this next offensive. Since the ceasefire, one hostage has been released, and as we know, the devastation that's been caused in Gaza with the resumption of attacks in a broad way, with a broadened offensive that we know is stepping up, according to Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think that the people of Israel are going to continue supporting Netanyahu if these hostages aren't released?
My understanding is, if we're talking strictly about the war, I do think a majority of Israelis currently support the effort, and this war is being fought differently in terms of tactics than it previously was. Hamas ultimately is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which seeks to establish a global caliphate. And part of the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda in establishing a global caliphate is the concept of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, the notion of expanding Islamist territory by virtue of war. And so what Israel ultimately is doing now by trying to take more and more territory in the Gaza Strip is to play out Hamas's game, not in terms of morally, but in terms of setting a message for Hamas.
Yes, but Jordan, I asked you a specific question about the hostages, and I want to come back to this. One hostage since the resumption of military action has been returned that Hamas has been holding. Over 50 are still being held dead and alive. Surely the issue around hostages, the one that is completely poignant to this whole conflict and the reason that such extensive military action has been carried out. If that's happening without hostages being returned, is there not a question to ask to the Netanyahu government as to why the military action is continuing if the hostages are dying while in captivity?
There are actually two motives for this war, Josh. One of them is to get the hostages released. The other is to completely disarm Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and all of their supporting factions in the Gaza Strip, because Israel simply cannot afford another October 7th where 1,200 innocent Israelis died by means of most grotesque manner. So what Israel is ultimately trying to do is to accomplish two things, sometimes which are conflicting with one another in terms of goals and agenda, which is saving the hostages, but also making sure that there won't be another hostage crisis in the future once Israel can properly secure its security.
Yes, absolutely. Jordan Cope, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing us with